Why do we always hear about extremes? Edge cases don't make the world. They're the exceptions to the rule. Fear sells. Extreme stories are interesting. They are things that people are more likely to click on, pay attention to. They're what get our focus and interest, and they get our attention. But at the same time, these are often extreme events, like unlikely events, edge cases that don't actually make up the majority of cases. And at the same time, often these extreme stories serve a sort of agenda. And like a big agenda is a fear agenda, right? Like if we're scared, we're more likely to buy things. And so perpetuating stories, even if they're extreme or even if they're extremely rare, they help perpetuate this sort of fear-based society where we need to stay in our houses, where we need to buy more stuff to satisfy that sort of emptiness that continues to grow inside of us because we can't live sort of these meaningful lives out in the world. And the whole thing, too, is like a scary world is a world that you're afraid to interact with, right? And so when you're scared, you have to stay inside and you probably have to, use Amazon or some other online portal to buy things instead of like going to the store by yourself, going out on your own. And in some ways, like that makes life more convenient. That makes my life more easy, but also like takes away like some of those like things that are interesting about life, right? Like part of the what makes life interesting is like the sort of serendipity of going out and meeting a random person and having a random conversation. And so like, yes, sure, these stories might represent reality, but they also kind of represent this extreme version of reality, a more scary version of reality. And the thing too is like a lot of these like extreme stories, like sometimes they end up not even being true. Like a really good example of this is like what happened at the Capitol riots, right? There was this huge story about this guy who got killed, and he was beaten to death with a fire extinguisher, but it ended up that story wasn't true at all. Like the guy didn't actually get beat up by a fire extinguisher. So it's like these extreme stories that like are really scary, like sometimes they are true, but sometimes they're false. Like sometimes they're not even true at all. But part of the problem is that these stories serve as like an anchor. They serve as a reference point for future understanding of events. But the thing is like often these extreme stories, they misinform us, right? And so when there's like a 1 in a million chance of something happening, like that's really uncommon, right? That's not something you have to be fearful. That's not something you have to worry about. That's not something you have to do anything about. Maybe it's an interesting story, but if you kind of get the impression that there's like a 1 in 100 chance or 1 in 10 chance, then it changes your behavior, right? And so the idea here is like extreme events are extremely unlikely. And so that's part of the reason why they're interesting, but they also kind of create this like false reality for us. They create this false narrative about the risk of things because we associate those stories with the reality that we live in, with the truth of what we believe. But the thing is that they're actually like the extremes. They're not normal. They're not usually what happens. And so this creates this like misunderstanding of risk for us. It creates this misunderstanding of danger, and also it influences our behaviors because when we're scared, we behave in certain ways. Whereas if we're like free and we believe that we're safe, then we might behave in a different way. And part of it is like, it could be like propaganda, right? Like these stories, maybe people are sharing these stories because they want us to behave a certain way, right? And so maybe it could be like from our own government, but it could be from other governments. Maybe other governments or other people, like third parties, are trying to negatively influence us, just influence us in a negative way so that we don't trust our government. And so but at the same time, right? Like it could be that our governments are sharing these stories because they don't want us to trust them, or we want to have like this negative perception of someone else. And so it's really complicated about how these sort of extreme stories could be used to influence our behavior. And like the most obvious explanation, of course, is that these are just interesting stories because they're edge cases. But the other side of it is that sometimes these stories get shared because they serve someone's agenda. For a lot of things that probably doesn't matter, but for some things it makes a big difference because when we behave in a certain way, that means that we might have sort of a detrimental effect to us, right? Like if you're afraid to go out, then you might be more likely to buy things, but you might buy things from online retailers, which then that sort of perpetuates into a situation where those online retailers have a huge incentive to keep you afraid, to keep you behaving in that way that you're behaving because it benefits their bottom line. It makes them profitable. Like that's a really easy example, but it is an example. It's hard to know whether or not this is done on purpose. It could just be like an emergent property. And I kind of feel like this is often the case. It's like, a news organization or like a Redditor or like just someone on the internet shares a story because it's extreme, because it's interesting to them. And while they're sharing these stories, their intention is just because they think that other people will find this interesting. But like sort of the unintentional side effect of it is that it it changes people's perceptions of reality, it changes people's perceptions of risk, and it changes people's behaviors. And whether or not that's good or bad is sort of beside the point, because it's not the intentionality, it's just sort of like an emergent property or a consequence of an action, which is just like a focus on extreme cases, a focus on extreme stories, a focus on like the most scary things, and opposed to the most positive things, or like the most likely things. This kind of becomes more important when like there's a crisis going on, or when there's a narrative going on. And like an example of this is like back around when 9/11 happened, there was lots of stories or information about like these weapons of mass destruction, and the story was like an extreme edge case, right? And then it became more popular, and then it became like the narrative, and then it was used to perpetuate war, or to justify war or fighting in a country. And it ended up that story wasn't true, but it was an extreme story, and it was a good way to justify action, right? And so like a lot of times these sort of extreme stories, they can be used to justify a response, they can be used to justify action. And whether or not they're sort of an accurate representation, whether or not they're actually, valid, is always debatable. It's always questionable, and we never know really what the truth of something is until after the fact often. And another thing that's important too, right, is like people often like latch on to the first story that they hear. They remember the first instance of something more than later instances. And this is part of the problem, right? Like if you hear like an extreme story, but it's say inaccurate, that's what you're going to remember. Even if there's like a rebuttal, or there's a clarification, or like there's an adjustment of the story later on, you're going to still sort of be primed by that original story, because it's going to be the first one you heard. It sort of anchored you to that idea, and like that is sort of what you use to understand future instances or future occurrences of that event, or as that event progresses, you're kind of primed by what you originally heard. Like why this might be important about being primed for these things is because like once you're primed to look out for things, or to think that something is likely to happen, then you start to remember it, right? Like it starts to kind of cloud your thinking about things, and you might start looking for it. And so it might not necessarily happen. Like maybe it does actually happen only 1 in 1,000 times. But because you're looking for it, because you've been primed to think about it, then you might be more likely to notice it. And that kind of is the risk of these sort of extreme stories, is because extreme stories create sort of this basis for looking at reality through a certain lens, through the perspective of that being a common occurrence when maybe it's an extreme occurrence or an unlikely occurrence. Problem here, or the big thing here, I would suggest, is that because we have like a narrative, we have this worldview that's framed by extreme stories, then it kind of creates this like narrow view of reality for us. It kind of clouds our perspective, it clouds our understanding, and it sort of prevents us from maybe seeing what's really happening in the world around us. Like, if I watch the news, or I go on the internet and I consume lots of information about things that are happening in the world, it seems a lot scarier than it actually is. But like if I just walk outside my door and I walk down the street, then I'm going to notice that, it's pretty safe, and it's pretty, like, I don't need to worry that much. And so like there's this like difference in extremes, right? Like if we only hear about the extremes, then we kind of get this like intellectual or mind-based worldview, and then if we like actually live our lives, we might not interact with any of those things ever, and so like we don't have those sort of experiences, and it's kind of creates this like cognitive dissonance where we believe like these scary things are dangerous, and then at the same time we don't really worry about them in our actions every day, because we don't have to, because we know that they're not actually something that we have to worry about, at least in our proximity and the things around us. But this is like the basic problem of these sort of extreme stories, is that they create this like distorted worldview where we think that things are one way, but then our experience shows us that they're a different way. The thing about these like extreme stories, right, is that sometimes they kind of get sent out, and then maybe there's like a correction to it, but then there's kind of like a lack of accountability, because once the story gets out there, then like people latch onto it, they remember it, they believe it, and it becomes a part of their worldview. But it's hard to erase that. And even after the story, if the story gets retracted later on, like most people won't read the retraction, they won't even know there was a retraction, and they already have that sort of built into their worldview, built into their understanding. It creates this like foundation that is hard to erase, that's hard to adjust, that's hard to sort of change, and get people out of thinking of it or change their minds about. because it's often too late. A lot of these stories, whether or not they're true, it doesn't matter, they do influence the way that we see reality, they do influence the way that we see future narratives. And so there is always that risk of these extreme stories, because they often don't represent reality, but they do frame our understanding of reality. My question to you is, like, what do you think of extreme stories? Like, why do they exist? Are they planted stories? Are they there for the sheer purpose of influencing our understanding? Are they there just because they're entertaining? Like, what other reasons do you think that they might exist for? Let me know in the comments below. Also, if you found this video entertaining or informative, click that like button. And if you're curious about understanding the world and you want to be sort of told how to think, but you don't want to be told what to think, then click that subscribe button, because that's what I'm here for. And you've been watching Making Sense with Robbie. Thanks for watching, and we'll talk next time. Goodbye.